Hello everyone, welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it is your online adulthood and aging psychology class, and I'm here to walk you through the hottest topics in personality. So let's jump right into it. And unlike what we usually do, beginning with definitions, I want to instead begin with an example, a specific empirical study on the Who I Am test slash 20 statement test. This is a kind of a classic measure of personality, wherein participants are administered a piece of paper, kind of in the old days, but now it's, you do it on computer as well, obviously. And it's just, and what's written on a piece of paper, or the prompt, is the words I am, and then a blank line. And then there's basically 20 of them, thus the 20 statement test. And you write, I am whatever that is to you as a person. And then coders will basically look at your responses and then do some coding analysis of it and then come up with results. All right, so looking at this specific study on the Who I Am test, these researchers conducted this study with Kenyan and American undergraduate students. However, well, I'll just read this and then we can break it down. Kenyan participants into groups that should theoretically vary in terms of how much they were exposed to Western cultural ways. There were Kenyan university students in Nairobi, which is the capital of Kenya, should be the most westernized group in their sample. The educational system was shaped by their British colonial past. Employed adults in Nairobi might be slightly less westernized, and the traditional indigenous Kenyan groups, such as the Samburu and the Maasai, would be the least westernized. Most frequent self-description for the Americans were personal characteristics such as trait, attitudes, and abilities, 48% of their statements. However, similar statements made up less than 2% of the Maasai and Samburu self-descriptions. The responses generally reflected their social identity. Their roles and memberships accounted for more than 60% of their statements and made up only 7% of American self-descriptions. So, kind of the quick review, we have this Who I Am test. It's administered to 3 groups of individuals, or I should say 4, really. You have American undergraduate students and then 3 groups of 3 Kenyan groups, one of them being Kenyan university students who are hypothesized to kind of be more westernized or kind of in a university setting. They've kind of gone through an educational system which was heavily influenced by the British colonial past. And then you have employed adults in Nairobi, again, kind of the capital of Kenya. So those kind of your interacting with businesses, you're working at a corporation, or influenced by capitalism and kind of like the flow of goods and people coming out of a large city. And then traditional indigenous groups, which would theoretically be the least westernized, primarily kind of residing in rural locations and kind of less exposed to, on a daily basis, to Western cultures. But obviously these various groups all travel around. And as stated, they filled out that 20 statement test, and then researchers examined the response patterns. And American undergraduate students, 48% of their statements were based around these individual traits, their attitudes, their abilities, again, kind of reflecting the role of kind of Western culture in the conception of the self in these American undergraduate students. Well, at the other end of the kind of the extreme of the distribution were the Maasai and Samburu self-descriptions, wherein only 2% of their statements reflected personal characteristics, that individual conception of self-identity. So again, reflecting the cultural influence on how one describes himself. In the traditional kind of Western psychology, personality is really thought to be like this entity, this unmoving thing that's essential to the self, that is consistent across all circumstances, is really kind of like confined within the self. While subsequent cross-cultural research has demonstrated that it's not a kind of a universal description or evaluation of the self. And yes, this is me when I was in Kenya with people from a Maasai village in rural Kenya, back when I was young, the good days. It's important to note, however, that Americans do sometimes think of themselves in terms of social identity, that is kind of the collective self. And Maasai and Samburu sometimes consider their own personal traits. The degree to which people from these cultures consider these different aspects of themselves varies considerably. The other two Kenyan groups, the workers who worked in Nairobi and the Nairobi University students fell in between those two groups, between the American undergraduate students and the Maasai Kenyans. The university students, interestingly, were closer to the American patterns in ways that they self-described themselves, and the workers were more closely resembling the Maasai and Samburu patterns. Again, kind of reflecting kind of the influence of institutions and exposure to different cultural ideas and how that impacts the definition of themselves. And in the top right, you can see results from this study. All right, so now let's jump into some definitions, beginning with a kind of a definition of personality. Enduring set of characteristics that define our individuality and affect our interactions with environment and other people. Study of personality psychology encompasses a range of topics, not rage, we're not that mad, traits, motivations, emotions, the self, the community, and coping strategies. What happens to personality as we go through adulthood into old age? There are continuous, personality is stable, but there are also changes within personality. So in this definition of personality, which I just grabbed from the book to keep it simple, you can kind of really see here kind of that Western influence to define our individuality and an enduring set of characteristics. But that's the definition we're going to work with. And again, the study of personality encompasses all these different traits, motivations, emotions, the self, and the community, and coping strategies. And there's debate to the degree to which personality changes or is stable throughout your lifespan. Continuing on with more definitions, personality traits are stable patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. How a person typically behaves in social situations. Personality factors are groups of personality traits that occur together in most individuals. They operate on a continuum. How many factors are there? Personality states, short-term patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors can be shy in moment even if you aren't shy. So we have these traits, these thought to be kind of enduring, stable pattern of thoughts, feelings, behaviors. Kind of can be conceptualized as how on average individual behaves and across a wide variety of social situations. And then you have these personality factors. The group of personality traits in statistical terms is referred to as clustering. So basically the idea here is that there are personality traits that are heavily correlated and thus they occur together. So because of the intercorrelated nature of some personality traits, they will naturally cluster, and thus if you're high on an X personality trait, you're likely to be related on also be high on personality trait Y if those are heavily correlated. So kind of just a basic definition of correlations, but the argument here is that some personality traits are heavily correlated and others are not. Versus kind of personality states, and anytime you see the word state in any psychology text, it's really kind of referring to short-term or kind of a temporary way that you're interacting with the world. So even if you're maybe an extroverted person, you could be shy or something within a particular moment for a whole host of reasons that are that may be environmentally based, but also maybe interpersonal or individually based. So maybe you're had a bad day or something along those lines, you don't feel like talking to anybody, or you're questioning yourself because you had a big fight or something along those lines. So kind of a short term, it's a state of being, versus a trait, kind of long term. Trait theory, the foundation of the big five. Trait models are interested primarily in describing and understanding the structure of personality. They are interested in what makes up our personality, not what causes it. They're interested in individual differences versus commonalities among people. Personality is a set of trait dimensions along which people can differ. Relatively enduring dimensions or qualities of personality along which people differ. Assumes that personality traits are consistent across situations. They expect carryover in personality throughout the life, but do not believe it unfolds in a series of stages. So kind of as stated, this is kind of the big trait theory, the big five. And they're, again, kind of the big takeaways here are that they're focused on what makes up our personality, not what's causing it, what's causing it to develop. They're measuring, okay, what is the personality? And then you can compare individual differences or commonalities among people. They conceptualize trait, again, kind of this enduring set of personality characteristics that are consistent across social circumstances. So they argue that that you have a trait, and it's you would expect to see the expression of those traits in all social circumstances across the lifespan. Continuing on with trait theory and Big Five, they use factor analysis to reduce diversity of personality descriptors to underlying traits. They analyze the correlation among response on personality inventories based on a lexical approach, assumption that the most crucial features of personalities are embedded in our language. Factor analysis of trait terms in dictionaries and works of literature. The Big Five has 5 traits: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So basically what we're getting at here is to identify how many traits there are. They had to have kind of some type of scientific methodology. They didn't just make it up. So what they did was this lexical approach, wherein they basically went to the dictionary and other kind of historical works of literature in the English language, and then basically coded each word, gave it kind of a numerical value for simplicity's sake, and then they ran some statistical analysis on it, and then they looked at which words were kind of correlated with each other based on kind of this numerical evaluation of the word. So for something like happy, joy, excited, something along those lines, those words will be kind of intercorrelated. And out of that correlation analysis, there'll be clusters of correlations. Again, happiness, joy, excitement, I don't know, fulfillment, something along those lines. Those words will be all kind of heavily correlated, and it's not just going to be those words, but hundreds of words, kind of like that, will be very highly intercorrelated, while other words like happy and daring or adventurous are not going to be that correlated. Those are kind of different constructs. So that's kind of what basically factor analysis is. It's kind of, you plug in all these words and you kind of look at these clusters of words together, and those clusters of words are called factors. Again, you don't need to know these statistical, it's not tested on this degree of statistical knowledge. It's trying to get at the point of how these traits came to be. So kind of an English language, kind of evaluation of words, looking at correlations between those words, and groups of correlations are called factors, and eventually all those words of the English dictionary, they settled on 5 factors based on all those words within the English language. And those 5 factors, again, being openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So that's where the Big Five comes from. And these Big Five traits are thought to be universal across all humans. However, there has been a subsequent analysis of the Big Five across cultures. So in general, such investigations reveal that although the Big Five model does appear to be fairly cross-culturally robust, it is not an exhaustive list of personality traits in all cultures or how often traits are used. Indigenous Chinese study found, for example, 4 of the same factors as the Big Five. Openness to experience did not correlate with any of the Chinese factors. And a new factor, interpersonal relatedness, which was uncorrelated with any of the Big Five. A list of Filipino personality traits was developed, revealed 5 traits that were highly similar to the Big Five, but there were 2 additional factors, temperamentalness and negative valence, which did not correlate strongly with any of the core 5 traits found in the US studies. A study of Arabic speakers in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and the Palestinian West Bank found evidence for the Big Five, plus honesty in unconventionality. And then finally, the Saimane, a flourishing horticultural group in Bolivia, found very little evidence in support of the Big Five. The personality characteristics that were explained better, personality characteristics in that population were explained better by just 2 factors, neither of which approximated any of the Big Five. Other studies with non-industrialized populations have had comparable results. So kind of what we're getting at here is that there is evidence that the Big Five that's been found in the U.S. Is cross-cultural. However, it is not. It has been found not to be an exhaustive list, and how often those specific traits are used varies across cultures. So in some studies, there are more than Big Fives. There's a Big 7. And the 2 new traits that they found, specifically in that Chinese study, you basically do another correlation. You look at correlations between those specific traits the Big Five in the US and the Big Seven in this indigenous Chinese sample, and then you just see if they're correlated. And the two additional factors found in this indigenous Chinese sample were not correlated with any of the traditional Big Five traits, thus representing, which means that there are theoretically additional personality traits within this culture. And you know, in other studies, as reviewed, there were other personality traits as well. And then, interestingly, in some cultures, there were less than 5 personality traits. Going back to the Bolivian example, wherein there was only 2 personality factors. So, so some evidence of universality of the Big Five, but sometimes there's more traits than the typical Big Five, and sometimes there's less traits in the traditional Big Five, and the degree to which the specific trait is present within a culture can vary as well. So basically, you can have elevated levels of high levels of openness to experience in one culture on average, or very low levels of openness to experience in another culture. Now let's talk about individualism versus collectivism, and collectivism, I should say. The independent and interdependent views of the self tend to emerge in individualistic and collectivist cultures, respectively. Individualist cultures encourage thoughts and behaviors fostering an independent self-concept. They value distinctiveness from others and being self-sufficient. Collectivist cultures encourage thoughts and behaviors fostering interdependent self-concepts. They value closer relationships and group memberships. The fulfillment of the self requires an overall collective well-being. So kind of just some broad outlines here, and I kind of wanted to quickly highlight that collectivist cultures, depending on kind of the environmental circumstances, there's not, we'll talk about this in the next slide, there's not like one the collectivist culture or one the individualistic culture. But some collectivist cultures basically argue that in order to fulfill the self, to meet your full optimal potential, requires kind of a commitment to kind of the greater social good. So in that context of kind of like harmony within the group, individuals can flourish. So I just want to kind of point that out, that there's not this idea of there's no individuals in collectivist culture, but rather kind of an idea of how kind of development occurs, and kind of not really kind of the absence of the individual, but rather kind of how, in what context can individual development occur, and we'll kind of touch on this later on in this lecture. Some notes on diversity among individualistic cultures. Independent and interdependent self-concepts are not meant to be a dichotomy, but rather a continuum. The same dynamic applies to a given culture as well. While Americans are generally individualistic, some are collectivistic, and some are more or less individualistic than others. Individualism and collectivism are endpoints of a continuum, not a dichotomy. Note that these cultural and individual differences really involve group averages. Cultural findings reflect general patterns, or average group differences. There is often a range of possible behaviors and exceptions to the norm. X culture is individualistic means that people in X culture, on average, are exposed to more cultural messages encouraging independent thought and behaviors than interdependent thoughts and behaviors. So, big takeaway here is not a dichotomy. It's a continuum, and kind of very important, and this is true across all psychology, how these kind of traits, these states, these psychological constructs, these developmental outcomes manifest themselves in real world behaviors, everyday behaviors, varies across the context. So you can imagine 2 people being both, for example, just making up something, extroverted, and what that actually means in daily practice will can differ wildly between people within the same culture, within the same household. And this is related to a whole bunch of different opportunities within the environment, social support, all these other factors. So just because you're high or low in something does not mean you're going to kind of behavioral outcomes or general everyday behaviors. So kind of it's kind of taking that out that kind of abstract kind of notion of whatever psychological outcome, and then applying it to the real world. And in the real world, those can be wide degrees of differences in behaviors within even people who have kind of similarities in some of these constructs. Where are individualistic and collectivist cultures found around the world? A survey of 117,000 IBM employees in 40 states found individualism is the highest in the US, followed by other English-speaking countries such as the UK and Western European nations. Collectivism is especially prevalent in Asia and Latin America, but also seen in Africa, Eastern and Southern Europe, and the South Pacific. Worldwide, collectivist cultures are more common, making up more than 80% of the world population. However, I should state that trends across the world are moving towards kind of more individualistic, and this is kind of a byproduct of kind of global capital and globalization and kind of this monoculture kind of thing that's developing across the world. Looking at cross-cultural findings in the U.S., the North Central Great Plains, especially around Minnesota and Wisconsin, is a friendly and conventional region, where residents are the highest in the country for the traits of extroversion, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. The Western states, from Oregon to Arizona, are a relaxed and creative region, where there is the lowest neuroticism and the highest openness to experience. The Northeastern states, especially New York and Massachusetts, are a temperamental and uninhibited region, where people score the highest on neuroticism and the lowest on conscientiousness. Extroverted people are more likely to appreciate wide open vistas, such as oceans, whereas introverts prefer more closed-in mountain regions. So basically what these researchers did was just kind of administer traditional kind of personality traits in different states, and then they kind of looked at intercorrelations among the personality traits within region. And then based on that, kind of you get clusters of personality traits within regions in the United States, which would make sense because particular regions of the country will be exposed to different cultural messages, kind of different jobs, different social circumstances, and thus kind of you can find commonalities or correlations among personality traits within geographical regions within the U.S. Personality researchers measure personality in different ways, and they're interested in there's different ways of measuring personality. And one way is differential continuity, which can be defined as the stability of individuals' rank order within a group over time. The most extroverted participant at time 1 remain the most extroverted at time 2. Personality trait rankings remain moderately stable throughout adulthood, and stability increases with age. Increase in rank order stability from age 6 to age 73. Patterns don't differ much from one personality factor to another, show no gender differences, and are very similar no matter what type of assessment method is used. Okay, so what do I mean by rank order? What are our big takeaways here? So you can imagine a longitudinal study of 100 of your classmates, and I'm measuring levels of extroversion within the class. And say I'm in the class or whatever, and I'm number 1 extroverted. And then there's some other person who's obviously the least extroverted, who's ranked number 100 out of 100. And kind of the idea here is those rankings, 1 from 100, are relatively stable, are thought to be moderately stable throughout adulthood. So the person who is ranked number 1 extroverted at time 1, if you measured that same group of people and measured the extroversion again 10 years later, you would expect that the person who's ranked number 1 in extroversion will either be first again or somewhere within the top 10. So very high ranking extroversion. So it's not like kind of the raw value, but where you fall within that ranking is what this differential continuity is getting at. Not the raw values, but your overall ranking relative to this theoretical the set of the entire population, basically, on a specific personality trait is argued to be moderately consistent across adulthood. And the rate of that stability, the degree of that stability, is thought to increase as an individual ages. Another way of measuring personality and change is mean level change. Mean level change is defined as changes in a group's average score over time. Mean level changes are attributed to factors such as maturation or cultural processes shared by a population. Stereotypes of changes in personality during adulthood are relatively stable across 26 countries. So kind of the idea here is that, so before we had that rank order, we had 1 to 100 again, and you're kind of measuring the degree of consistency of, going back to the example, extroversion across a longitudinal study. Now what they're doing is a mean level changes, mean is the average, the group average. They're measuring the degree of the group average across time. So you can so instead of measuring measuring, you can take the same example as before. So measuring 100 of your classmates on extroversion, and I combine all the scores on this extroversion test. Say you score whatever, I'm just making up a number, a 5 out of 10 or something, I don't know. And then I measure it again 10 years from now, and now you scored the same group has scored a 7 on average. So now I can kind of look at and try and evaluate, okay, why is it that this group is now more extroverted? Did something happen in the population? What is going on to cause this? And then obviously you can look at different cohorts through time and see what the group averages, again in that example, kind of extroversion are through time. So mean group averages. And next we have intra-individual variability, stability or instability of personality traits within an individual over time, measuring the actual scores, not the rank order between people. Research suggests that all 5 factors of personality show variability in changes for individuals. The Berlin Aging Study 2 tested changes in personality in older adulthood, 1,200 people aged 65 to 88. Neuroticism and conscientiousness decreased during aging. High levels of neuroticism was associated with higher levels of illness, lower grip strength, and slower cognitive speed. All right, so we already talked about the group averages. We talked about the rank orders, wherein, again, kind of giving a test of extroversion. You score whatever you score on the extroversion test in a class of 100, and then I rank you. One person's most extroverted, and then the 100th person is the least extroverted, and everything in between. And then researchers are interested in the degree or the level of stability of that rank order across time. Now this one here, this intra-individual variability way of measuring, looks at the actual scores. So I administer that extroversion test to you, and then whatever, again, going back to the previous example, you score between 0 and 10. And instead of using the rank order, I look at your raw score. So did you score a 9? Did you score a 10? Did you score an 8? Now, kind of for statistical wonks out there, these rank in the raw score are going to be kind of correlated, but they're going to be different. Why is that? Because rank ordering, if you imagine 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to 10, or to 100 in the class of 100, they assume that ranking, kind of that way of ranking, does not take into account the distance in scores of an individual. So what do I mean by that? So imagine, again, class of 100, you can score between a 0 and 10 on the test. Say ranked the 2 most extroverted people in the class, ranked number 1 and number 2, they score a 9 and a 10 on the extroversion test, okay? Now imagine numbers 3 through 100, those ranked, 3 to 100 in extroversion, they all scored between a 4 and a 1. So you can see 1 and 2 is way up high, and then that's like this one cluster. And then number 3 to 100 are very close. So the degree of separation between the scores of 3 and 100 are actually way closer than to each other than the scores of 1 and 3. So even though the rank order 1, or I should say rank order of 1 and 3. So rank order 3 and 100, again, being scores between 4 and 0, being very close together, while rank order 1 and 2 being scoring 9 and 10 on the extroversion scale, being very close together. So rank order is correlated, but you can see here that the distance in scores can be gigantic, and that's not factored in the rank order analysis. The intra-individual variability kind of analysis looks at raw scores, not rank order, and then measures the degree of change or continuity of those scores within an individual across time. And then the specific study, this Berlin Aging Study, found that neuroticism and conscientiousness decline with age, and high levels of neuroticism associated with all these other outcomes. Again, speaking to the intercorrelated nature of all these psychological constructs. And when you start free falling in one, you can kind of free fall across the board. So you can imagine being highly neurotic, and then isolating yourself, not reading anything, being depressed, not working out, and then you get all these intercorrelated outcomes. So kind of again, we have the mean average, which is looking at the mean average over time of groups. We have the rank order, looking at where you rank across time in a theoretical population, and then you have your raw score changes, which is just looking at your intra-individual, within the individual, the change and the stability of your raw scores on extroversion across time. So again, kind of that level of statistical analysis, not required for this quiz. There's kind of a little breakdown of what's going on behind the scenes. But moving on to manipulating personality, argument that personality is based on beliefs about the self, and it is possible to change those beliefs and thus the self. People who believe intelligence was malleable was more open to learning, more willing to face changes, and more resilient after failure than people who believe intelligence was fixed/inborn. Life events such as marriage, divorce, retirement, and having a child can impact personality. So basically this theory, and people who support this theory are arguing, is that how you view yourself and kind of how you view the world will thus kind of change the self. So kind of the idea here, the classic example is if you believe intelligence is fixed, inborn, innate, there's nothing you can do to change it. You either have it or you don't. So kind of the idea here is you can imagine a scenario wherein somebody believes that in the fixedness of intelligence, they take a math quiz and then they fail the math quiz and they're just like, screw this shit. I can't, there's no point of studying, trying hard because I literally cannot improve. Intelligence is fixed. Versus someone who maybe believes that intelligence is not fixed, are more open to learning, believe that intelligence is malleable. Thus, they believe that, what my behaviors can influence my level of intelligence on this hypothetical math quiz, or as measured by this hypothetical math quiz. Thus, studies have found that these people who believe intelligence as being more malleable are more open to learning, more willing to face challenges, and more resilient, which makes sense because if you believe that you can actually address this poor grade in this math quiz because intelligence is malleable, you'll try harder. You'll be more resilient because you have a fundamental understanding of how the world operates. Thus, you will change your behavior and thus kind of view yourself. I'm not stupid. I just have to, keep grinding or whatever to get better at this quiz. And not only that, but the specific kind of large life events can impact your personality, how you define yourself, how you view the world, and then thus kind of your behaviors, which then kind of creates and generates self. So kind of a self is kind of always in the state of flux and related to how you define the world and how you kind of define how you believe certain developmental outcomes occur. Next, self-consistency. Researchers have noted that cultural differences in the level of self-consistency are shown by participants. Cultures differ in motivation to be consistent across situations. In one study, participants were asked to sit in different contexts, such as a professor's office or with another student, and describe themselves using the 20 statements test. Japanese participants varied in their self-descriptors depending on the context in which they took the test. American participants responded similarly across all contexts. So this goes back to this idea of trait, this universal, this stability of the self, and also how you view yourself, going back to that manipulating personality slide. So in this study, again, the 20 statements tests were administered, but what the experimenters did was administer the test in different settings to two different groups, Japanese students and American students. Some of the students took the test in a professor's office, and other students took the test with a fellow student, with a single student seated next to him, and then another group took the test in kind of just a large group, a traditional kind of like classroom setup. And as stated, the Japanese individuals had different response patterns in how they described themselves depending on the context in which they were in, while Americans had far less variability in how they described themselves across contexts. How can this difference be explained using the independent, interdependent views of the self? The interdependent self is flexible across contexts because it's kind of dependent on other people or influenced by other people in your environment. Whereas the independent self conceptualizes the self as stable. What challenges does this pose for cross-cultural studies? This challenges a methodological assumption in personality studies that may not have considered the context in which participants took the personality measures. It is not clear which context provides more accurate results or true self-measurement. So kind of the idea here is that when researchers are administering this task, maybe they should consider in what context the task is being administered, and especially across cultures. Because, as found in this study, how someone describes himself differs depending on, describe their personality, I should say, differs depending on the location where they are describing themselves. And thus, it brings an even larger theoretical question of what is the true measurement of self and what is the actual accurate result? And that is a heavy question that is still kind of being worked through, obviously. All right, so what do personality traits actually do? There are 3 areas that are believed to be shaped by personality: relationships, achievement, and health. Personality and relationships. Choice of relationships influences who we choose, often somewhat similar personality traits. Behavior with patterns determines how we behave towards partners. How we react to a partner's behavior can contribute to escalating conflicts. Influence on partner's behavior invokes certain behaviors from one's partner. High neuroticism and low agreeableness associated with elevated levels of defensiveness and criticism. So kind of straightforward here, but personality can impact who it is that you want to be in a relationship with. And also it can impact the behavior of an individual's behavior to their partner and then their partner's behavior back to them. So if they have a low agreeableness, both partners have low agreeableness, this can escalate into just high levels of defensiveness, criticism, and kind of a negative relationship, and just, a state of kind of escalate behaviors. It can impact how the response patterns to kind of daily challenges. So how do you react in response to whatever, some kind of issue at work or issue within your relationship or your family, for example. So kind of personality impacting your reaction to hardships or just daily living, as well as kind of having this interactive dynamic approach wherein both partners' personalities influencing each other, and in the case of kind of low agreeableness and high neuroticism, kind of create this escalatory process wherein the relationship kind of decays. Personality and achievement. Traits that make up conscientiousness are important predictor of work-related markers of achievement, competence, order, dutifulness, and self-discipline, integral to completing work effectively, paying attention, striving towards high standards, and inhibiting impulsive thoughts and behavior. Big 5 personality traits predict good job performance if the job is a good match for the personality. Sociocultural contexts impact the application of these personality traits. Conscientiousness in the 1930s was found to be associated with a woman's commitment to wifehood. Today is associated with career commitment. Openness associated with creativity, match well with interdisciplinary fields, able to connect separate areas of study into a coherent science. All right, so kind of our big takeaways here is that big 5 personality factors being correlated with job performance if the job is a good match for the personality. And we discussed kind of vocational developmental trajectories in previous lectures. So kind of if you have a strong match with the wherever it is that you work, your personality matches your job, then there can be kind of a strong correlation between high agreeableness or conscientiousness and kind of work overall kind of performance. Now, interestingly, going back to my kind of previous discussion on just because you're high on a specific personality trait or any like psychological construct, it does not mean that all individuals within that like high ranking are going to have uniform behavior. And it's really dependent on your environmental circumstances. And one environmental circumstances is the historical area you live in, your social cultural context. So for example, conscientiousness in the 1930s was associated with a woman's commitment to wifehood. However, whenever the study took place, 80 years later, it was associated with career commitment. So kind of the restrictions and the kind of on women's access to the workplace and kind of fundamental changes within family structure and kind of economy, politics, whatever, creating environmental conditions wherein those personality traits can be kind of manifested in different behaviors across time. Another study, another kind of example of this is openness associated with creativity. So theoretically, some scholar who's very open is less kind of rigid in kind of their understanding of whatever their field is, and thus are open to kind of this interdisciplinary field. And thus are kind of like creative and are combining all these different fields together into one, hopefully, coherent science. So you can see here that the application of creativity can vary. So in this case, kind of like a scholar and kind of interdisciplinary studies, and then you can imagine some artists, doing some great painting or something, who's high in openness to experience. Personality is associated with health and longevity. People with high levels of conscientiousness and low levels of neuroticism tend to live longer. People low in agreeableness are at higher risk for heart disease. Personality can directly affect the functioning of the body. Conscientiousness is associated with lower levels of inflammation. Personality can lead to behaviors that promote or undermine health. High neuroticism is associated with higher risk with smoking. Personality may be linked with coping mechanisms people choose with dealing with stress. So kind of just a few takeaways here. Agreeableness, for example. So if you're high agreeableness or some moderate amount of agreeableness, some reasonable amount, whatever that means, a doctor recommends something to you, medication or diet or exercise, whatever, these people are more likely to follow that advice and thus live longer. Versus the opposite, not following a doctor's advice, not stop eating fast food, not exercising, whatever, and then leading to a higher risk for heart disease, for example, or earlier death, or living longer, or living but like less quality years of life, or a healthy life. So kind of in some contexts, low agreeableness can be good. So I don't know, you can imagine a very unstable neighborhood or state or something along those lines, and you disagree with everybody because you recognize that like this environment is like adverse. It's hashtag toxic or whatever. Therefore, I'm going to be low agreeableness with everyone, and that may be adaptive in that context. I'm not going to listen to anybody. I'm not going to join any games that are going to involve in anything. But in the context of this medical situation wherein a doctor is telling you to listen to me and you're low in agreeableness, then that can be kind of a negative outcome wherein you're at higher risk for negative health outcomes. So sometimes even kind of the like quote unquote worst personality traits can be adaptive in some sorts, or positive adaptation in some circumstances and negative in others. Risky behavior and conscientiousness. A meta-analysis of 194 studies examined scores on conscientiousness related traits in 9 different health behaviors. Conscientiousness was significantly associated with each behavior. Men with wives who had high conscientiousness scores reported better health than those with lower scoring wives. Same was true for women with conscientious husbands. Healthy and unhealthy behavior interact dynamically within households and communities. Conscientiousness has also been found to be associated with less heavy drinking, less smoking, and lower waist circumference. So here we have this big 5 trait, high conscientiousness being associated with particular health outcomes. And interestingly, within a particular household, if someone's low on like conscientiousness or some kind of moderate, again, kind of whatever that means in this abstract sense, and their partner is high in conscientiousness, that high conscientiousness partner can kind of act as a protective factor for their partner and increase their conscientiousness, or at least kind of a hashtag manifest high conscientious behaviors within that partner. In this case, kind of health. But also worse, vice versa. So if someone is low in conscientiousness, or both of individuals are low conscientiousness, it's kind of act as a multiplier effect, and then you're just kind of doing very risky behavior at that point. And then obviously that can take place within a community. So harsh circumstances, adversity, kind of low investment, just general poverty within a neighborhood can kind of cluster and kind of create or be kind of an engine of particular behaviors, which then can kind of, again, multiply, serve as kind of like a multiplying effect. to increase kind of the risk of numerous negative developmental outcomes. Potential explanations of personality change. 1, genetics. 20% of variance, in personality types is heritable. The 5 major factors are influenced by genetics to about the same extent. There are a few gender differences. Monozygotic twins scores for 5 personality factors show higher correlations than scores for dizygotic twins, suggesting that there is a genetic influence for personality traits. But kind of as reviewed in previous lectures, it's kind of difficult to kind of disentangle prenatal environment, but kind of taking this at face value here, we have you can compare different sets of twins and then kind of see how correlated they score on these big 5s, and then the difference can then be kind of used to calculate a total quote-unquote heritable score on different anything really, but in this case the big 5 personality traits. And then you can generate some number. The number I put in question mark is kind of really a questionable science, the kind of attributing the level of genetic influence based on these type of studies, but that's kind of how that works. And depending on the study, but for the purpose of this class, the 5 major traits are suspected to be influenced by genetics to the same extent. Environmental influences. Environment has an effect both directly and in combination with genetic factors. Changes in mean level measures and personality are most common in young adulthood. Conscientiousness, emotional stability. Cohorts have different levels of mean level personality traits, reflecting changes in macro, chrono level of factors such as social values, political economic systems, laws. Experienced discrimination can lead to negative effects on personality. Discrimination associated with decrease in agreeableness and increase in neuroticism. So kind of our big takeaways here is we have looking at mean level change. You can do so across cohorts, as I already stated, and those mean level changes in personalities are thought to reflect these larger macro chrono level environmental factors. And so thus the different cohorts on average can have different levels of personality traits. And also, kind of going back to my poverty example, but here, discrimination example, discrimination has been found to be associated with decrease in agreeableness, which kind of makes sense. So if you have kind of quote-unquote authority figures within a community and acting as sources of discrimination, that's going to have an effect on that population and contribute to, for example, lower levels of agreeableness because that individual, just kind of a hypothetical individual, can recognize on some level that this person is treating them unjustly, they're being discriminated against, thus I'm not going to listen to this person, I'm not going to kind of respect this institution or whatever, the kind of general, like the collective good, or the, this quote-unquote collective good, or this institution, thus my overall agreeableness will decrease due to this environmental influence, specifically in that example, discrimination. Moving on to specifics of the independent and interdependent view of self, researchers have suggested the existence of a fundamental difference in how the self is subjectively organized. Independent and interdependent. Marcus and Kitayama argue that this difference is based on people having either an independent view of self or the interdependent view of self. Now, this is kind of the slides that I teased last week, and I've alluded to in this chapter. Beginning with the independent self, it derives important aspects of identity from one's personality characteristics or inner attributes. Identity is distinct from one's relationships. In this figure, the circle around the individual does not overlap with the other circles. An important aspects of identity are one's personal characteristics. X's inside circles are aspects of identity, and the larger ones are more important for self-identity. These inner attributes include preferences, opinions, and traits. The self is stable and consistent across different situations and throughout the lifespan, and the border around the individual's circle is solid, representing the stability. Individual does not change much from situation to situation. Now on the right is kind of one hypothetical figure. There's different competing theories of this, and this is just one that I'm using for an example. And again, kind of speaking to the idea of the self, of personality, the impact of others and your environment on how you define yourself, what you believe your personality is. In this case, the independent self. This is kind of like a traditional view of self in the West, wherein I have these inner attributes. I'm myself. I'm unchanging. I'm stable. No matter the circumstances, there's not going to be that much change in my personality. There might be some change, but overall, my preferences, my opinions, my traits are going to be consistent across all circumstances. In this case, you can see the individual being encircled by this solid circle, which kind of represents like, you're contained within the self, you're stable, you have that border that protects your inner essence and thus leads to stability over the lifespan. You have an in-group, but the individuals within your in-group do affect you, but you still have that consistent self. And even within that in-group, you can see the in-group line is dotted, representing a kind of a fluidity of your in-group. Friends can kind of come and go, but it's not that big of a deal because, I'm me. I can make new friends. It doesn't matter. I really don't have as much, I don't have that many social obligations to other friends. Some friends I do, but kind of overall, I have 1,000 Facebook friends. I talk to like 2 every day. It's not that real. And thus kind of the degree of, I could also be more open to self-disclosure to a stranger because, again, I'm me. And friends come and go, and it's really not that big of a deal that I'm kind of sharing about myself to other people. Self-attributes are also unique. The self is perceived as self-contained, arising from the individual and not from interactions with other people. The self is viewed as a coherent entity. Individuals feel the need to publicly present themselves as consistent with these attributes. There's considerable fluidity exists between in-groups and out-groups. New relationships are easily formed and old relationships are easily dissolved. This view is characteristic of a more Western cultures, such as Americans, as in the study comparing the Americans and Kenyans, which I talked about in slide 1 and slide 2. So kind of again, it's already stated here, yourself, you're unique, you're self-contained, and yourself and personality overall is kind of not really influenced by interactions with other people. So therefore, it's not that real that people bounce between my in-group and out-group. Because at the end of the day, I'm unique and I'm kind of on my own personal quest for fulfillment based on my inner attributes, my inner essence. The interdependent view of self. The self is viewed as a relational entity, fundamentally connected to important relationships. Identity is interdependent with others and one's relationships. The overlaps of one's own circle and one's relationships suggest that relationships with others are as an important part of self-identity. Roles, relationships, and memberships constitute important aspects of the self. Both X's lie at the intersection between individuals and significant relationships. Identity changes across situations as roles change. The self is not bounded or separate from others in the surrounding context. The dotted line around the individual circle indicates the self is not a self-bounded entity, but rather is influenced by relationships. A clear distinction exists between in-group and out-group, strong loyalty and commitment to the in-group, but little willingness to cooperate or conform with out-group members. Solid boundary between in-group and out-group suggests that it is not easy for out-group members to become in-group members, and in-group members do not easily fall into the out-group categories, characteristics of much of the non-Western world, including the Maasai Kenyans. So kind of as stated here, you see the dotted line around the individual personality, the self, representing the influence of other people within your in-group, your environment, on the self. So family members and close to friends. And that in-group circle is solid. That is, it's difficult to get into the in-group and it's difficult to leave an in-group. And this kind of calls back to last week when we talked about the Ugandans having more frenemies on average than Americans, because it's very difficult to get out of an in-group and you have social responsibilities and obligations within that in-group. Thus, it's difficult to leave that in-group and get into that in-group. And thus kind of the self, the personality is wrapped up and influenced by people within that in-group. but also your roles, your relationship, where you kind of stand in society impacts your kind of personality in this view of self. And this kind of, again, alludes back to that self-consistency study, which the Japanese and American students were, and the Japanese individuals were more likely to describe themselves, their personality, in different terms, depending on their immediate environment. There's neural evidence exists for the distinction between independent and interdependent views. When participants were asked to use a list of adjectives to evaluate themselves and their mother, Westerners showed different regions of activation. Chinese showed activation in the same regions linked to self-representations. So kind of the idea here is that thinking about the self and about thinking about others will have particular neurological patterns of activation. So these experimenters asked Western students and Chinese students to think about themselves, how they would describe themselves, and then they measure that neurological activity, and then they ask those same participants to think about their mother, and then measure that neurological activity, and then basically run a correlation on this. A little more complicated than that, but that's basically the easy way to think about it. And what they found was that the Chinese individuals within this study found kind of similar levels of neurological activities when thinking about themselves and thinking about their mother. So kind of, again, kind of representing this interdependent view of the self versus Westerners showing different patterns of neurological activation when thinking about themselves and then when thinking about their mothers. Okay, now let's talk about gene-environment interactions. This can be defined as the effects of genes depend on what kind of environment we experience. How we respond to the environment depends on what genes we have. Often it's a combination of high-risk genes and high-risk environments to trigger psychological problems. So kind of straightforward here, we have gene-environment interactions wherein the impact of genes, in these hypothetical genes that are influencing behavior, are dependent on the environmental circumstances. So kind of the effects of how those genes manifest within the environment depends on the environment. And I should note that it's really not just gene. It's really conceptualized now as this super network of genes, multiple genes working together to do something. Kind of similar to kind of neuroscience now, where it's not really just one kind of region, but really kind of interconnected, complex neural networks. And it's kind of conceptualized now as well as kind of on a genetic level that occurring as well. I've had colleagues who work on this. So kind of, again, this the environment influencing how genes kind of manifest in behavior. And the idea here is that high-risk genes, so genes that are thought to be associated with certain high-risk behaviors, combined with high-risk environments, are the circumstances that are placing an individual at risk for the most negative developmental outcomes. Gene-environment correlations, also referred to as transactions in the book. Genotype-environment correlations, process by which genetic factors contribute to variations in the environment. People with different genes have different experiences. Beginning with passive genotype environment correlation. Occurs when children passively inherit the genes in the environment that their family provides. Because parents provide children with both their genes in a home environment compatible with those genes, the home environment to which children are exposed are correlated with and are typically likely to reinforce their genotypes. It's called reactive transactions in the book. Evocative genotype environment correlation, how the social environment reacts to individuals based on their inherited characteristics. Whether one has a more outgoing or shy temperament will affect how he or she is treated by others. It's called evocative transactions in the book. So like everything in psychology, there are a million constructs that are often very interrelated or kind of the same thing. So here we have passive genotype correlation being called reactive transactions. But kind of the takeaway here is that you're inheriting some genes from your parents, and but also you are also inheriting literally like your parents' home environment. So you're born with X genes, but then you go home immediately and are in parents' homes who were designed by those parents who have particular genes that you just inherited and have basically designs homes in kind of a way that reflects their genes, kind of on an abstract theoretical level here. So we have kind of basically this home environment that's created, reinforcing kind of your genetic inheritance. So you're inheriting genes, you're born, and you're brought home immediately, and then surrounded by stimuli that are kind of reinforcing those kind of genetic predispositions. So you're passively receiving it as like a baby, basically, or all through adulthood or childhood, I should say. This is called reactive transaction. So you're reacting to it, you're passively receiving it. Versus kind of evocative, so you're kind of, this is the social environment reacting to you. So you're walking around and people are treating you a certain way based on their evaluation of your personality. So if they evaluate you as outgoing, maybe they'll say, oh, look at this young kid, or even young kid, and then they'll interact with you in kind of an outgoing way, an extroverted way, maybe versus a shy kid where you recognize that they're shy, and then you are maybe more cautious, or recognizing their shyness and just being aware of that and interacting with them in an appropriate way. So it's the environment reacting to the individual and then acting and then thus kind of reinforcing again that kind of the theoretical genetic predisposition. So in this case, the environment literally reacting to an individual. So we have passive, where an individual, this child, is receiving, kind of just being like flooded over with stimuli in their environment, reinforcing their genetic predispositions. And evocative, or transactions or correlations, the environment reacting to the individual. In this example, kind of interpersonal communication, thus kind of reinforcing those genetic predispositions. Next, we have active or proactive genotype environment correlations. Occurs when individuals seek out environments that support their genetic tendencies. The individual with a genetic predisposition to be extroverted is likely to go to every party in sight, invite friends over, join organizations, collect Facebook friends, and otherwise build a, quote, niche that is highly socially stimulating and strengthens social skills. Genotype environment interactions involves genetic susceptibility to the environment. The concept of gene-environment interaction tells us that people with different genes react differently to the experience they have. By contrast, the concept of gene-environment correlations say that people with different genes have different experiences. Adoption studies provide evidence for genotype environment interactions. Okay, so beginning at the top here, we got active and proactive transactions / correlations. This here it's proactive, it's active. It's an individual seeking out environments that support their genetic predispositions or their tendencies. So I'm very extroverted. I'm going to go to the party. I'm YOLOing it everywhere. I'm accruing Facebook friends. I'm acting in a way in creating environments and seeking environments that reinforce my extroversion. So if I'm introverted and I just stay home and just game all night or whatever on Saturday night, then again, I'm kind of creating, it's an active genotype correlation, a proactive transaction, wherein me being an introvert, I'm going to stay home and just game all night instead of going out. And then gene-environment interactions, and the big difference here is all that you need to take away from this, is that gene-environment interactions really deal with how an individual reacts to different experiences they have. So if they have a high genetic predisposition to anxiety, for example, and they encounter an anxiety-producing or anxiety-inducing environment, an unstable environment, that person with that genetic risk for anxiety disorder will, greater risk of developing their anxiety disorder, because that environment is basically activating that gene. So you're reacting differently to the same stimulus due to kind of your genetic predisposition. Versus gene correlation is really stating that people with different genes have different life experiences. This is either through passively, because you live in a house that your parents designed for you. That could be, again, the social world around you, your family members treating you a certain way because you're shy or outgoing, and being active, so seeking out environments yourself. So having literally different environments in the correlation, the genotype environment correlations, having different environments, versus kind of your risk and your how you react to different environments and experiences. That is genotype interactions. Okay, looking at the psychoanalytic view of personality, Freud believed personality formed during first 5 years of life, did not see psychosocial growth continuing during childhood. Anxieties, for example, arise from early experiences in the family, reveal themselves in adult personality traits. A neo-Freudian, Erikson, proposed that people undergo similar personality changes at similar ages, placed more emphasis on social influences such as peers, teachers, and culture, and saw the potential for personal growth and change throughout the lifespan. So classic Freud, everything that happens, your entire life, basically development is based on very early years of your life, and then all the behaviors that you see throughout adulthood and throughout aging are kind of just manifestations of that early experiences. Erikson believed that and argued that social influences, peers, teachers, cultures all also impact development, not just those early, primarily maternal interactions during the first 2 years of your life. And he saw potential for personal growth and change throughout the lifespan. Thus, you always see these Erikson levels of change that occurred throughout the lifespan. Kind of on a similar vein here with the psychoanalyst, ego development. Jane Lovinger theory, stage-like levels of ego development. A person must complete the developmental stages of one task before moving on to the next. Rate of movement varies widely from one person to the next. Everyone must take the path, but the rate differs across people. These stages include the impulsive stage, wherein individuals themselves, or I should say view themselves, and that's the magic, that's movie magic right there, as separate humans, egocentric, dependent on interactions with others, preoccupied with bodily feelings like a baby, self-protective stage, conformist stage, identified themes with reference group, concerned with rules and cooperations, self-awareness stage, conscientious stage, form own ideals and standards, individualistic stage, autonomous and integrated stages. Life is complex, recognize themselves in wider social concerns. So kind of what we're getting at here is how an individual develops their ego and thus kind of their self and throughout the lifespan. Again, this is kind of a stage theorist approach wherein you have to complete kind of all the aspects of one stage to get to the next stage. So it's kind of like a set of stairs wherein at each stage you unlock new abilities. And these are kind of universal. But the rate on which that you go through these stages differs by an individual. And kind of the overall idea here is that you kind of go from this like, I'm very dependent on other people, I'm preoccupied with my bodily feelings, I'm very egocentric, I am baby, to kind of more a conformist stage, where you understand that there are other people and there are rules that exist, and I'm going to kind of be hyper-focused on those rules and following like cooperation. Then to kind of creating your own standards, your own values, your own morality, and then kind of going through this individualistic stage. And then finally, kind of at the end, kind of being like this, life is complex, I'm concerned about myself, but other people as well. It's kind of this theoretical model here of ego development. And how do you measure ego development? Washington University Sentence Completion Test of Ego Development. It is a test used across the lifespan. Participants are asked to complete 18 sentence stems, which consist of, quote, my mother and I, quote, a man's job, and, quote, rules are blank. Total score is computed that correlates to a particular state of ego development. Young adults' ego development stage was found to be a reflection of problems in childhood. People with a history of externalizing behaviors were below conformist level at age 22, whereas internalized disorders associated with being with below conformist level at age 22. People at higher levels of ego development describes career or religious changes in terms of integrative themes, having new perspectives on the self and others, describes growth as increased self-awareness, better understanding of relationships, and more complex moral reasoning. So our big takeaways here is that this study found kind of correlations between the stage of ego development and certain developmental outcomes. So being below the conformance stage, being associated with externalizing behaviors. So kind of something like impulsive stage, for example. So kind of straightforward. You're acting impulsively, preoccupied kind of with yourself, your own feelings, and thus maybe I'm more likely to engage in just externalizing behaviors. Versus kind of the same thing here, but in this case, internalized disorder. So maybe being so reaching the conformist stage, for example, being concerned with rules, but being kind of like hyper concerned with rules, and then just kind of dwelling and on your ability, how well you're succeeding in following those rules. So kind of like an internal looping. And then externalizing behaviors being associated with maybe impulsive stage, where again you're kind of just acting impulsively and externalizing, and thus demonstrating behavior consistent with externalizing disorders. So kind of being below that conformist stage, being associated with different types of disorders. And while people being high levels of ego development, having that life is complex view, recognizing social concerns, being kind of associated with this integrative theme, where I'm self-aware, I'm having more complex moral discussions, I'm interested in myself, but also kind of interested in larger societal issues and developing stronger interpersonal relationships. Our next kind of theory here is George Valent. I'll go with mature adaptation. He accepts Erikson's stages as a basic framework. However, he inserts an additional stage between Erikson's stages of intimacy and activity, career consolidation, intent on establishing own competence, mastery, positive social standing. Mature adaptation, potential progressive changes, and ways adults adapt psychologically to the trials and tribulations face. Individuals may develop in a certain direction, but not everyone moves in the same direction and distance. Defense mechanism, the main form of adaptation, set of normal, unconscious strategies used for dealing with anxiety. Everyone has defensive mechanisms to deal with the world. He argues that some are more mature than others. Mature defenses are more reality-based. So kind of the big takeaway from this theory is this idea of defense mechanisms. So as people are developing, they're going through these stages, they're adapting to challenges of the world, the trials and tribulations of the world, as well as dealing with general anxiety of just existence, I guess. And what he's arguing is that thus everybody has defensive mechanisms to kind of navigate the world, to live their daily lives, and to progress through these stages of development. However, all defensive mechanisms are not created equally, and the more higher levels of development have more reality-based adaptation styles. So for example, someone having a high level of adaptation, their defensive mechanism may be some kind of altruism or some kind of solidarity or something along the lines, wherein the individual will deal with kind of their existential threat about cancer or something along the lines by, I don't know, being a scientist or fundraising or advocating for whatever public health program along those lines, versus dealing with the fear of cancer or something along those lines, just having awful relationships with your spouse, being super stressed out, and I don't know, eating unhealthy or not exercising, something along those lines. So you have different. So everybody has kind of these defense mechanisms, but the positivity and the maturity associated with the defensive mechanism varies. Gender crossover. Relaxation of gender roles that is hypothesized to occur in men and women when the parenting years are over. Argued to represent a gain in personal freedom, new roles within a group. Mayan, Navajo, and Druze societies, men move from active mastery, involving making changes in external circumstances, to accommodative mastery, making changes in one's inner self. Women take on more active mastery roles in these societies. Druze kind of mainly consisting in like Jordan, Syria, Israel. Involves a complex biopsychosocial phenomenon that involves hormones, social roles, historical changes, and economic climate. Depends on what opportunities are available. So kind of the idea here is that with time, there may be shifts in the amount of behaviors that are traditionally or that are like categorized as traditionally masculine and traditionally feminine, and kind of through this process of fluidity in these gender specific, theoretic, historically argued, but not super supported, gender specific behaviors. Those that becomes less rigid with age, thus kind of representing a new gain in personal freedom and new roles within your group, and kind of the societies that I outlined. Men moving from active mastery to accommodative mastery, and women taking on more active mastery roles. And of course, this involves a complex biopsychosocial phenomenon, wherein social roles, historical changes, economic climate, hormones, all these kind of interacting to provide opportunities, environments wherein people, groups can engage in kind of these more fluid behaviors. Culture and gender. Some people may think that interdependent self-concepts seem more characteristics of women, and independent self-concepts seem more characteristics of men. Researchers examined people of different cultures and genders and whether they differed on collectivism, agency, assertiveness, and relatedness. Significant cultural differences: independence as measured by assertiveness and agency, and interdependence as measured by collectivism and relatedness are different in different cultures. However, there are few gender differences. Only reliable differences was relatedness, when women scored higher than men. There are no differences found for collectivism, agency, and assertiveness. So kind of straightforward here, looking at these measures of interdependence and independence within various cultures and comparing them across gender. And in general, there are no gender differences in society and kind of in these societies that the study analyzed. However, some gender the only reliable differences, or I should say, not a reliable universal differences. There can be differences within a society, but the idea that these are universal gender differences that have existed across all of time was not found. However, there was one reliable gender difference found, that was relatedness, with women scoring slightly higher than men. Skipping ahead to positive psychology, which is defined as the emphasis of psychology research to turn away from negative outcomes such as mental illness and crime, and toward positive outcomes such as well-being, optimism, and spiritual growth. Focuses on positive individual traits at the individual level and civic virtues on the group level. So kind of the idea here is they're arguing that, psychologists are too negative, therefore we need to focus on these largely personal achievements and positivity within research. And I linked to this scholar's book, kind of Bright-Sided, which gives a really a heavy critique of this approach to science. She kind of argues the opposite. Basically, she was diagnosed with cancer, and in her experience when she went to self-help groups and just groups in general, they were hyper-focused on this idea that if you're not positive about your cancer diagnosis, then you're kind of guilty for your cancer and your development of or continued progression of your cancer symptoms. So thus she's kind of arguing that in general, there's actually a hyper focus on positivity in the U.S., in which kind of inadvertently or overtly kind of really focus on these individual traits and individual thought patterns, which are kind of suspected to kind of quote unquote or whatever hashtag manifest themselves in kind of health outcomes. So kind of competing theories here. And our final theory, self-determination theory by Richard Ryan and Edward. We'll go with Dacey. Edward, if you're listening, I apologize if that's wrong. They argue that personality based on individuals evolved inner resources for growth and integration. The need for personal growth and personality development is essential to human nature. The extent to which we achieve our personal growth is the basis for our personality. Eudaimonia, which can be defined as a sense of integrity, well-being, kind of, or like human flourishment. kind of overall human fulfillment. Includes basic needs for competence, autonomy, relatedness, hedonia, happiness involves the presence of positive feelings and the absence of negative feelings. Environments which do not foster these basic needs will result in compromised sense of well-being. This is a macro theory of development, primarily are situated kind of in the realm of intrinsic values. Three components are needed for life fulfillment or optimal development. Competence, the feeling of effectiveness as one interacts with one's environment. Feeling challenged, seeing results. Can involve changing the environment, selecting activities to perform, and redirecting resources. Autonomy, the need to feel our actions reflect our true inner selves and not someone else's rules or guidelines. And relatedness, the feeling of being connected to, cared about, and belonging with significant others in one life. Someone/a group is with you, social support. Study found that college graduates who expressed intrinsic goals, such as growth, relationships, and community, had a higher chance of achieving goals and having a high well-being than those who express extrinsic goals, money, fame, and image. So this is a massive theory. I feel like you can take an entire, like literally a whole semester teaching this theory. But kind of the big takeaway here is that individuals there's an innate kind of species characteristics of humans, wherein we are on a quest for personal growth and fulfillment of kind of like overall well-being, and to reach that overall self-fulfillment, that optimal development requires competence, autonomy, and relatedness. So competence, kind of feeling challenged, seeing results, interacting with the environment, feeling effective, contributing in some way to your environment. Autonomy, so I have these intrinsic values, I have these kind of unique aspects of me. I have strengths, I have weaknesses, and I want kind of my those strengths, those weaknesses, my intrinsic values, my interests to be kind of dictate my life. So that can be in the workplace. So whatever my intrinsic values are, I want that to be kind of represented in my labor, or I want them to be represented in my personal relationships as well. And then finally, relatedness. I need social support. I need to be connected to something. I need to belong to something kind of bigger than myself. And I want to, but at the same time, I want to be cared about. So you can see kind of this notion of like intrinsic motivation, this individual development, but within a context of interrelationships and overall kind of like social welfare and social support, which are centered around intrinsic goals. So growth, relationship, community versus extrinsic goals. And these are classic studies of the differences in educational outcomes, relationship outcomes, and people and groups of individuals who focus on intrinsic motivation, intrinsic goals versus extrinsic goals and extrinsic motivation. Okay, so with that said, that's all for this week. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next week. Bye.